Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Drew Armstrong. I am the executive editor of Endpoints News and your host of Post-Hoc Live. We had some breaking news last night that we're going to be unpacking. We're going to be talking about the FDA today and its relationship with the biotech industry. Late yesterday, the biotech and vaccine company Moderna issued a pretty unprecedented announcement detailing a contentious back and forth with the FDA over their mRNA-based flu vaccine. The FDA issued what's known as a refuse to file letter, which means it's not even going to look at the application until it sees some changes. We'll get into why that's important, what it tells us about the FDA's approach to vaccines, and about its relationship with biotech in general. Now, the company has claimed that the FDA moved the goalposts on a trial that has been in the works for years. It made some, I think, very aggressive and more candid statements than we have seen from biotech. But we have also seen a lot of companies beginning to push back more vocally against the agency and its actions under this administration over the last year. And we'll talk about that as well. We have a fantastic group to talk about this. We've brought in our own Endpoints expert team, Max Baer and Zach Brennan, who have been covering the FDA, vaccines, MAHA, the MAGA movement, and everything going on in Washington under the Trump administration as a health regulator. We also have Tom Randall. He's the head of Endpoint Signal. He talks to everybody in the biotech and pharma industry through his Endpoint Signal surveys about how they feel about where the industry is, their regulator. And he has some great data that's out recently, in particular on sentiment around the FDA and how it has turned sharply negative. So welcome to the show, guys. It's a pleasure to have you here. Thank you for being with us. We are going to get right into things. For those of you who are joining us on YouTube today, you can use the chat to join the conversation and ask us questions. If you miss us live, this recording will live on YouTube and Spotify and Apple Podcasts out after the fact. Now, Zach and Max, I want to start with you guys because I've been doing this for a long time. And one of the pieces of wisdom that I feel like gets passed around all the time is that, you don't criticize your regulator in public. If you're a company that has business before the FDA or might have business before the FDA, you keep your mouth shut, even if you don't like what's going on, because it's not worth risking, any kind of blowback. It's just, there's not a lot of value in saying something publicly. And then all of a sudden, over the last 12 months or so, since we've had the Macquarie Prasad FDA and under HHS under RFK, it feels like that's changed. And we see companies that have business before the FDA, they get a negative answer and they start to make comments that feel pretty directly like criticism. I think one, I guess, Zach, let me ask you. I mean, you've been covering the FDA in detail for a really long time. Is this as unusual as I think it is? And why is this happening now?
Yeah, so I think companies, especially companies that have multiple products that need to be reviewed by the FDA, and if they're in an ongoing process of having a product be reviewed, they don't want to jump the gun and yell at the FDA and say, "Hey, what are you doing?" Because they still have to go back to the FDA and have a conversation with them about
Right.
how to eventually advance their product. But yeah, I mean, I think you got to really point to kind of the political side of FDA at this point, right? I mean, we're seeing Vinay Prasad, political appointee, head of CBER, really overruling his underlings who are all, professional employees at the FDA. They're all scientists and doctors whose job is to review those products. So I think we're seeing a big infusion of politics here.
Yeah, and we've seen a number of these cases, right? I mean, with some gene therapy and some rare disease stuff. I think there's been a lot of talk about. I feel like the word surprised gets used a lot in the company communications we see.
Yeah, we've seen, at least a half dozen examples, I think, since the Trump administration took over regarding surprise, or at least executives who are surprised that, but, having said that, I think a lot of these companies too, there have been so many layoffs at the FDA, often the reviewers who they were talking to before the Trump administration and now who they're talking to now maybe aren't the same people, or maybe the people who are above them are no longer working there. So there's some kind of incongruence sometimes between what they're hearing now and what they're hearing before.
I want to just bounce off what Zach said there because I think it speaks to why we're seeing criticism now. In the past, when some of the higher center director level people, had maybe more alignment or at least more discretion to review teams, a criticism of the FDA or your application is really a criticism of the review team. And I think that's more precarious and frankly sort of feels like a low blow if you're a major company and you're sort of like poo-pooing a decision by the FDA and you're then denigrating lower level staffers who are sort of doing their best and coming to their own objective conclusion. Now, all of the criticism is aimed at senior leadership who, by all accounts from our own reporting and other outlets, are overruling the reviewers who are coming to a different conclusion. So, in essence, there have been times, not all of them, where I think the companies are in fact sort of standing up in a way for for the FDA
Yeah.
staffers who feel
No,
like
that's
they
an
don't have a voice.
yeah, yeah, that's an interesting point, Max, that I mean, there's, I think maybe some of what we're seeing here is reflective of, disagreement within the FDA as much as it is between, disagreement between the companies and the FDA. Max, can you take us through, I mean, the Moderna news last night? Just walk us through everything that happened and I think why this was so surprising.
Yeah, I think as you alluded to, a refuse to file letter is sort of like such a hard stop sign that I think Moderna was going to need to provide some sort of explanation about why it wasn't accepted. And not only did they explain, they sort of detailed through this timeline of its interactions with the agency. From April 2024, which was sort of described as like a phase three alignment meeting with the FDA. So again, this is pre-Trump, pre-RFK, pre-Vinay, last year of Biden. Marx is still there. Up until August 2025, which is when they had a pre-submission meeting, the feedback that Moderna had gotten in April of 2024 was that, hey, we sort of recommend that you use a different vaccine in your phase three trial for the 65 and older group because the US has a preferential recommendation that they get a higher enhanced dose. This is a trial, by the way, that was running in people 50 and older. So Moderna was sort of making a calculation of, well, a standard dose flu vaccine is the comparator arm against testing relative vaccine efficacy against their own. Let's just do a standard dose that will apply to 50 to 64. This will be the best one to use in this global trial. So, despite the FDA giving them a bit of a suggestion, which was really to impact a later regulatory process, they had alignment. The FDA sort of greenlit the protocol. There was no clinical hold, which Moderna pointed out. The FDA could have done that if they thought there was a genuine safety concern or an issue with the trial. The phase three runs. Fast forward to August, the feedback from the FDA gets a little sharper. They said in feedback that it will be, quote, a significant issue during review of your BLA that you don't have this higher dose comparator in the trial. But again, I think Moderna took that as like they're taking a bit of a risk in the submission, but all the feedback suggests that they can still submit it and it will still be reviewed. They filed for approval in December of 2025, so a couple of months ago. And then the last update they have was in February. I'll just make one note too that they submitted an additional analyses to the FDA, which we haven't seen and I don't think has been made public, showing the Moderna flu vaccine to a higher dose that I think was a sub-analysis in a separate part of the phase three program.
And we're
So,
gonna,
yeah.
yeah, and we'll dig into some of the, I think what we know from our reporting, and I think what we can kind of parse out from some of the things that are in this communication. I want to back out real quickly with Tom here because Tom, you every quarter have had a survey out in the field asking people, I think in great detail who work in this industry and what they think about all sorts of things going on in biotech, but the government and regulatory environment in particular, you had a story out based on that analysis earlier this week. I mean, how does the feeling, I think it's, one of the things that people have really struggled with is that, you look at like fundraising and M&A and the XBI and like things look really, really, really good. And then you hear about cases like this and you're like, wait a second. Like, people always say like, having a great regulator is one of the most important things you can have in a biotech ecosystem. What's going on out here sentiment wise? How do people feel about this? You've done some actual data work on this.
Yeah, so one of the things that I think makes this Moderna decision particularly damaging is the context and how the industry was already feeling. And so we recently put out the Biopharma Sentiment Index where we survey 1,000 people in the industry. And like you said, things were kind of looking good. The top line numbers were looking up, confidence is up, funding pressure is easing, deal activity is thawing, and on paper, the industry was finally starting to look like it was breathing a little easier. But there was one category in our survey that was different, and that was regulatory environment. And it was just like off the charts bad. 70% of people said that things were worse than they were a year ago versus like 7% who said it was better. So that's terrible. But then when you get to the comments, that's where you really started to feel it. We had over 900 comments to our open-ended questions, and it was just this overwhelming outpouring of frustration. And I'll say, they were pretty unfiltered. And 20% of our comments were focused on the administration, politics, and largely focused on the FDA. There were not one, but two references to the batshit crazy administration, which made our headline. But one of the comments that really stuck out to me was there was an FDA reviewer who wrote in saying that they have fewer reviewers now, the institutional knowledge is gone, and in their words, the situation was perilous. And it just seems like that just seems like very relevant to what we're hearing today from
Yeah.
Moderna.
I mean, and these are people who are in general optimistic, right, about like where biotech is going. Like these are not, I think, like if you look broadly at where our survey respondents feel like these are not a bunch of like, Donnie Downers, like who are like, everything's terrible. Like they actually seem reasonably, more optimistic than they were, right?
Correct. We had improvements across every question that we ask about in our survey, apart from that regulatory question, and it was just an extreme outlier. And there were a lot of comments about how, like you said, most of the comments were positive, like things were really moving in the right direction. But we had a lot of people saying, there's money sitting on the sidelines. People, one person said the regulatory uncertainty and the total unpredictability of this batshit crazy administration has everyone sitting on their hands due to the risk of policy changes having unknown impacts to the industry. So really, it's that uncertainty. It's what makes this Moderna case so radioactive isn't just that it's one refused to file. It's that it fits this pattern that people are across the industry are seeing and naming out loud. And yeah.
Yeah, Zach, I think we got an audience question in the chat that I wanted to turn to you that relates to what Tom said. I mean, like this is I think we do make a lot of this, and we've been covering a lot of this kind of trend of overrules from the top, but like as people love to point out, like there's a history, there are other historical cases of, senior staff at FDA, overruling junior staff. And we had an audience question that was, why is this different from, Peter Marks overruling staff? What feels different about this? And I think Tom has alluded to the pattern here, but yeah, why does this feel, I think, why does this feel different than that?
Yeah, so I think the use of the refuse to file letter, which is typically only used for like mistakes in an application, or you didn't submit the data, you didn't submit the complete data set, or something in your application just was kind of, done incorrectly. And then the FDA says, no, we can't review this. The fact that they're, kind of retroactively looking at a trial design and then deciding to make a refuse to file based on that, I think is very much unprecedented based on, not only conversations with FDA, but, I think a lot of industry people see this. And yeah, it's scary to see that they're now, which, I mean, ostensibly, like these should be questions that come before the review team, right? Like,
yeah, yeah. Can you dig into this a little bit more? Because like, where is, if we've got an argument essentially about this is an argument about a portion of the trial population, like the older group in the trial population, right, are over 65s, and what should the standard of care be for them? But the trial is bigger than that. Like, where are these types of debates usually hashed out because my impression from talking to you previously is like yeah, exactly as you're saying, like these are not debates that are hashed out in a refuse to file decision. They're debates that get hashed out in a approval decision where the FDA maybe takes a narrower view than what am I right about that?
Yes, no, 100%. And I think that's kind of part of the reason why this was so alarming is, before, we had seen Prasad kind of overrule some of the review teams on certain applications. That was one thing, but to overrule, the review staff and the director of vaccines at the FDA on like a refuse to file letter, I think is very much next level. These letters are also often signed and written by review staff and by, career employees at the FDA. To see a center director step in and, draft and sign one of these letters, I think is very much unprecedented.
Yeah, and I know you had some reporting, as did one of our competitor publications, earlier today, basically saying that Vinay Prasad, he's the super director, oversees biologics vaccines, had basically stepped in and done this, signed this himself over what it sounds like was maybe not the same decision made by what we know about the review teams that were looking at this application. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. It sounded like they had kind of come to their conclusion that this was a reviewable product and they submitted that to him. And then he said, no, it's not. And then he wrote the refuse to file letter.
Uh,
Yeah.
Max and Tom, I mean, what does this tell us about, I think, investment in the industry? Because, this is a big trial that Moderna was running and they had a lot of money behind it. I mean, Max, what do we know, what do we know about like how big this thing was and how much it was costing them or how much money was behind this thing and kind of, what that tells us about the ability to invest in the industry when you talk to people kind of in the vaccine space, or elsewhere in biotech?
Well, yesterday was such a great example because I literally had covered a story earlier in the day about the largest private investment in a vaccine biotech in more than 2 years. And when I spoke to some of the investors and they're working on an intranasal whooping cough vaccine, they actually credited the FDA with some regulatory flexibility about what that phase 3 program might be. Now, post Moderna, does that sort of throw into question the agency's willingness to sort of stand by whatever was decided at that end of phase 2 meeting? I would imagine. But then, day ends and you have the news from Moderna. When I was talking to people, like they haven't described sort of a chilling effect on the vaccine space generally. And I recognize too that this moment sort of speaks to also some of the decisions that were made in gene therapy. I think if you were to talk to investors, they would be cautious to say that any one regulatory decision or even a batch of them is going to like hinder an entire field. And all it means is you have to get even more clarity in your conversations with regulators. And that has to be communicated. It has to be in writing. And then you have to sort of run this extraordinarily flawless trial. So, maybe in the short term, it's just how much you're spending on a given clinical trial. But I think people are a little hesitant to over extrapolate, despite, I think, fair concerns that the decisions from the FDA are more sweeping than anyone would like to acknowledge about their individual company or their individual portfolio.
Mhm.
Yeah, I would say on the other hand, though, sentiment, it's a very fragile thing, and we had just seen over the last 3 months people really starting to the sentiment really starting to come around on the funding environment, and people really thought that things are kind of loosening up. And I think a decision like this, people are going to be looking at the fact that, Blackstone put in $750 million backing these trials. And what happens to that kind of investment? What happens, like Moderna's market cap was knocked down like $2 billion today. Like that's a significant impact from, this kind of regulatory uncertainty. And it's something that had already been happening. This feels very much like the Sanofi example as well, and it just seems like something that could really start to blow out the kind of early building confidence in funding in the industry.
I just have two more points on that, and I think it spins investment in a little bit of a different way. First of all, the other key element of the healthcare policy apparatus that we've been reporting on has been this massive influx of large companies saying they're going to pour X number of billions of dollars into US manufacturing, let me just tell you, like, to be clear, like, this is definitely under the assumption that their drugs will be able to be approved and sold in the US. And I think, like, to the degree that this widens in large pharmas like the Sanofis of the world feel like that isn't happening, I can tell you for sure this is going to shift from the CBER office to the White House, just as a function of what is being asked of these companies, but what they expect in return. The other thing, thinking about investment, and this is what Stephen Hogue, Moderna's president, told me yesterday, is like they're launching these things in Europe. So
Right.
there's an element where they're like, this is just the US for however long RFK and Vinay Prasad are in office, just missing out on technology that the NIH has invested in. And I think Moderna is obviously pissed because of market cap losses like that, and because this is a big, financial opportunity for them to jump into the flu race. Oh, and by the way, this is also critical to their combo vaccine that's now effectively on ice indefinitely. But like, they're still pursuing these things ex US, and I think they're kind of just lamenting the fact that like that's a strategy that they've had to sort of embark on because the US is just not a trustworthy partner regulatory wise right
Yeah,
now.
I thought those comments by Hogue were, that's something that should haunt policymakers. America is falling behind on accessing its own innovations, he said.
Right.
Like Moderna's expecting its first flu vaccine approvals in Europe this year. So you've got an American company built on American-funded mRNA technology that may be selling a product overseas before it can sell it at home. And if your goal is to make America a biotech leader, refusing to even review an American company's application is a pretty bold strategy in trying to pursue that. That's always been kind of the knock against Europe and European regulators and things moving slowly in Europe. One of the questions that we asked in the most recent survey was, if you were starting your career today, where would you start it? And it was still the majority of people still said in the United States, so that should be affirming. But about 27%, I think, said China or Asia Pacific in general. But only 9% said they would start their career in Europe. And I think this is it's really interesting that I think that part of this, that element of this, should really be, taken into consideration in that context. In that, a lot of the comments that talked about Europe were specifically about this issue about things don't move quickly enough, and yeah, and now we've got that situation in the United States.
Max, I mean, you cover like the Maha MAGA movement and a lot of vaccine skepticism and even anti-vax stuff that's come out of this administration. I mean, I think there is some nuance here because this FDA has not knocked down every single mRNA vaccine that has come through their doors, right?
Right. To the contrary, Moderna had 3 new approvals or label expansions. Well,
Yeah.
label changes, I should say. It was within the confines of sort of the more stringent COVID parameters that Prasad and Macri laid out, but they still got those updated approvals. So, I asked Stephen Hogue, straight up whether he just felt like this was an effort by the agency to sort of stop this particular company with this particular technology in its tracks. And he was hesitant to say so. I think like he was in a moment where I sort of would have expected a comment being like, "Yup," if that was the case. Because I think Moderna was clearly like having a bout of true honesty yesterday. And so I think like he did sort of come back and he says, "I think this is a flu issue with this particular application." Moderna obviously is working on other therapies. I think to zoom out to Maha, a consistent theme, which I reported on last year, is that, people are very frustrated that the COVID vaccines are still on the market. And I know that ACIP is gearing up to sort of look at what it can do to limit their access at their upcoming meeting in February. And I think this is obviously an FDA decision to make, but it is hard for me to just sort of look past the parallels there, where it's, the next up mRNA vaccine that comes before the FDA.
Yeah.
You have some of the more hardliners within the Maha camp, of which Kennedy is sort of an apostle-like figure, asking for much more restrictions on at least the COVID product, and I would probably guess that it extrapolates to flu, and here we are, right? Like it just doesn't.
I certainly, yeah. I mean, I have to imagine if you had a meeting with the FDA in 2024 on a vaccine and you thought you knew where you were supposed to go, you probably need to be talking to the FDA again and making sure that that's still true. Zach, what happens next here? I mean, what's the next step for Moderna? Like, what do we need to be watching in terms of their actions? Does this thing have any, like, is there a path forward from, an answer like this? I mean, how does this, where, I mean, is this lawsuits? Is this talking? Like, where do we end up here?
Yeah, I mean, I think they have to schedule, correct me if I'm wrong, Max, they scheduled like a type A meeting with the FDA to review the refuse to file letter, which is like the next immediate step.
Yep.
But yeah, I think the idea that they would file a lawsuit over this, especially now that they know that internally there's, some differences between the review staff and the political staff, they could potentially take this to court. I don't know. Yeah, as kind of Max and Tom alluded to, like, who's to stop some of these vaccine companies from just kind of pausing the work that they're doing and waiting for this administration to kind of clear out and then, restarting it again. Not that that is, maybe financially feasible for a lot of companies, but yeah, I think everyone's got to kind of take a hard look at this administration and think, okay, we've got a couple more years left here. Maybe if we submit and there's different leadership coming up, things will change for us.
And that has happened. I mean, Valneva just suspended its it was on a hold, and it decided to just end its application for its chikungunya vaccine, which had its own issues last year. Like was sort of under investigation, then off investigation, then back on investigation. They just, they wiped their hands, I think, at the very beginning of this year of trying to relaunch that thing in the US in the meantime. And, different products, different applications, different concerns there. But you are just seeing companies being like, why are we telling investors that this could happen when we don't really think that it could? And I sort of wonder if like that is how we're sort of seeing Moderna's shifting comm strategy a little bit, just propping up Europe, being, extra transparent in its communications with the FDA and just seeing where does this get us? Because the alternative isn't helping.
Yeah, well, this is a live story. Obviously, lots going on here. I don't want to keep you guys from making the phone calls to sources and tracking down what happens next here. So we will let you go. That is all the time we have for today. Thank you, everybody in the audience who joined us on short notice. We'll be following all of this closely. You can sign up for our newsletters and our breaking news alerts to learn a little bit more. As soon as we have anything, you'll have it next. Recording of this conversation will live on YouTube, also be up on Spotify and Apple Podcasts shortly. If you're already signed up for our Post-Hoc newsletter, you will get notifications next time we have a new broadcast coming up. If you're not signed up, head over to endpoints.news. Then in the top right-hand corner, hit the reader profile link, then preferences, then click to activate Post-Hoc. You can also follow us on X, LinkedIn, YouTube, Spotify and Apple Podcasts, and Blue Sky by searching Endpoints News. Huge thank you to our producer, Nicole Wetzman, who is getting out of town in a few hours and pulled this together at the very last minute, and our very own amazing engineer, Dalen Turk. I'm Endpoints News Executive Editor Drew Armstrong. We will see you the next time news breaks.